Hi everyone, it's Cris Worley. Thank you for being here. I'm about to ask Robert Sagerman to join us, so please give me a moment while I get him connected. Always some technical kinks to work out, so one moment. There he is. And he's going to be joining us here in just a moment.
Okay, did it work?
Yes, all right. Okay,
Okay.
folks, we are now joined by the fabulous intellectual Robert Sagerman. um,
Hello. Good
Hi,
to see
Robert.
you.
How are you?
Hi. Thanks for getting me out into the light of day.
Glad you could make it. So,
Yeah.
so tell us where you're coming from, Robert.
I am coming from the Pine Barrens of South Jersey.
Wow.
So I'm about halfway, I guess, between Philadelphia and Atlantic City. So smack in the middle of nowhere, basically.
How nice.
Yeah.
So, and I'm coming from East Dallas, and we've got a little bit of sunshine right now. Um, so, Robert, you just had an exhibition at the gallery that was sadly kind of cut short by the COVID-19 situation that we're
Yeah.
all very familiar with now. And it was our second exhibition, and we were so proud of this glorious work. So we wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you. We had such a good visit when you were here in Dallas, and thought we could sort of spread some more of that love around with our viewers here on Instagram today. I'm actually going to attempt to share some images from the show while we're talking. So if everyone can also bear with me while I'm working on that as well, I will attempt to do that. It looks like it's not coming up right now, so we'll just keep talking. Um,
Well, I should say thank you while I have a chance for that amazing install that you guys did. It was fantastic and a real pleasure for me to be able to see everything in that kind of setting. Totally different than in here.
You know, that's what artists always say when they come to the gallery after it's been installed is they walk around and look around and go, "Wow, it looks so
Yeah,
different in here."
yeah, yeah.
Because
It's
usually,
different. It's different enough for me just when the in here when the light is changing, because the shadows on of the paint change, so that is already disorienting enough. But to actually see things in good conditions, it's really surprising sometimes.
well, and also a lot of times artists don't have room for the entirety of their show to be hung all at the same time, and to see it in a completely,
Right.
fully installed arrangement, and to see how other people interpret the work and hang the work in tandem uh, can be kind of interesting too. And in that way, it's kind of a little bit of a partnership between the gallery and the artist, and just in terms of how it gets installed and how it looks in its final sort of exhibition display anyway.
Right.
But anyway,
Yeah, that set of work especially because there were different ways of working and I wasn't able to see them all together and they related to each other in ways that I wasn't anticipating. You know,
Yeah.
there were monochromes and multicolors and gradations and
Yeah.
all different types in there. So that was
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. I'm hoping to show those on my phone, and I'm going to keep working on that while we're talking. But
Okay.
nevertheless, so Robert, I want to talk a little bit about you as a person
Oh boy.
because
May I be excused?
because I think your work is your practice, your work, your philosophies, and your life philosophies. I think are all very much in sync. And I mean, I wasn't kidding when I said that you were a true intellectual because I'm sitting here looking at your credentials, and you have a BFA and an MFA from Pratt, as well as a master's degree in art history from Pratt. But then you went on to get a PhD at NYU. Now, so you have 2 degrees in studio art, 1 degree, well, I guess that's 2 degrees if you have a master's degree in art history, and then the PhD in Hebrew and Judaic studies.
Yeah.
But even before that, and I hope you don't mind my talking about this, but before that, you were in the military. You served in the military. Can you tell us a little bit about why the age you were when you went in, why you chose to do that, and then maybe your path from doing that to finding art?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the same motivations were at work really, and I see the influence of that time in what I do to this day, in how I approach the work and my actual practice. I can still see those influences. So I went out of high school. I went to West Point, and they were mostly just sort of idealistic motivations to sort of, you know, reach my potential. You know, at that time, the slogan was "Be all you can be," and I was all about that. And I felt like as far as the military was concerned, I thought that would be good for me because I felt like I wasn't very disciplined and I could use a little kick in the rear coming out of high school. And West Point was definitely all about that. So it was really great for me. And I left after my second year because I realized I didn't want to make a life of it. And there was a service obligation if you stayed in. But I went directly from there to making a portfolio. So I had before I left there, I knew what I wanted to do. And it was really the same sort of motivations, the same kind of idealism and wanting to, you know, maximize my potential. But really in my work practice to this day, I approach things in a very regimented way, just how I approach studio time
Yeah.
and you know the discipline of the paint application itself is I think once you know that's where I came from, you can see it in the work.
Yeah. Well, that was exactly what I was going to say is discipline. That is like a theme that runs throughout your life. Uh, Someone who has studied as much as you have has to have a lot of discipline. The fact that you want to uh, be all you can be and be the best person that you can and maximize your potential, you have to have a tremendous amount of discipline to do
Yeah.
that. And so I'm not able to share my images. I mean, I've got everything else on my phone except the images of yours that I just loaded. So for some reason, it's given me the no line. So we're going to talk.
Yeah.
You've got actually some paintings behind you, and I might ask you to kind of get a little closer
Yeah.
in a moment, just for the audience members who aren't as familiar with your work in person. Um, these canvases are layers of very obvious, what we would call brush strokes or brush marks that are, or painting marks that are very thick, succulent, juicy, and in some cases they have patterns. not only the color is making a pattern, but also the movement within is making a pattern. And Robert, I want you to tell us a little bit about the process of making these, maybe while you bring the camera to a couple of these behind you,
Okay.
and you can tell us how exactly you go about creating these canvases.
Right. Okay. See if I can, if you can hear me while I'm behind there. Can you hear me talking?
Yeah,
Okay, great. I hope I don't make anybody seasick.
that's
So,
looking pretty good.
what I wanted to say, it occurred to me later, also about the issue of discipline and work practice. I started to learn really later on that really contemplative practice and meditation requires all the same kind of discipline. So that was a kind of a discovery for me. I don't know. Can you see okay this
Yeah,
way?
beautiful.
Okay. There's a. Should I take you around the whole place?
Uh, sure, why not? I do want to talk about the painting process though
Oh,
first.
right. Okay. Well, I'll show you over here. I apply the paint with a palette knife. So here are some small batches. Usually I'll be mixing up larger batches in a mixer.
Okay, wait,
Um,
if you will just sort of hang on each area for a moment, then the
yeah,
camera will focus.
how's that?
Yeah, let's see those palette knives.
Okay. So there are some on the wall there. Can you see the milling machine there?
Not no, so go down to your milling machine.
Okay. There it
There
is.
you
You see
go.
it?
So
Yeah.
tell the viewers what that is.
Okay, so that is, let me move this. This is a three-roll mill. So that's what this is what professional paint makers use. I have a very small tabletop model. So because of the quantity of paint that I use and also getting the consistency the way I want it, I started to discover that I would be better off making my own. So that's been a learning curve in its own right, learning how to make my own paint. Um, so I can make, gallons of paint way less expensively than buying things from an art supply store. And it's also been it makes it much more of a holistic experience for me when I'm starting from raw powdered pigment and oil. I actually make my own sun thickened oil, so I have a little station outside where I farm oil and thicken it in the sun so I can get the right consistency to my paint. Um, and then from there, there's a further process when I actually find the color that I want to use. I have to, further adjust the consistency of the paint so I can get the right application with one of those palette knives.
Right.
Uh, yeah, and
So
then
so the milling machine actually you see there are rollers there,
right, three
and
rolls.
those rollers basically you are smashing pigment and and the oil together in
Right,
and that is, I mean, back in the what 18th century they just ground and ground and ground
right,
and just did this by hand over and over and over and over again till they could mix it till the powder and the oil were completely uh, one. But
yeah.
you have the benefit of having a machine now that
Yeah,
can
I would be practicing something else if it was back then.
yeah,
There would be no way.
you're not throwing somebody a shilling to make your paint.
Right, right.
Um, okay, so then that that paint is then applied with the palette knife onto the
Right.
canvas. But then
Yeah, mark by
also,
mark.
but then now let's talk about the discipline of that act of putting the paint on the canvas.
Okay, so well, originally the practice was much more of a just an aesthetic. There were references to nature that were interesting to me, in the sort of textures that would emerge from the paint when I applied it that way. But over time, the practice, I would say, became more conceptually oriented in a certain way. I started to pay attention to as much to what was happening on the canvas as what was happening to me during the practice, especially as time went on, when I was able to, devote, large blocks of time to painting. You become very preoccupied with what's happening in your head. And that's when I realized that, the extent to which my practice had become a contemplative or meditative practice, which ended up leading me into the academic pursuits that you were talking about before.
Right. So just to get a little bit more in depth with that, you actually keep track of the numbers of marks that you make on the canvas, and you keep track of that in a journal daily, but you also keep track of that in your head daily, which is something that even after 3 or 4 years of working together, I actually did not get. And that is that at the end of the day, you tally up the number of strokes and write that down, and at the beginning of the next day, when you endeavor into the painting again, you start off with that sequential number, but you're keeping track of the strokes in your head.
Right.
And that's where the real meditative aspect comes in, because you can't let anything else into your mind. You have to shut out all chatter. You can't be thinking about anything else except the act of making. And that is what is interesting to me. That truly is a mantra. That's a meditation. And so your studies then, tell us a little bit more about those studies and the parallels.
Okay. Right. So originally the studies weren't about this particular aspect of things. I kind of learned about some meditative practices that were similar to what I do kind of later. Initially, my interest came about because I was just really pushing painting in kind of two different directions at once. I was seeing all color field painting, and I characterize this as a kind of color field painting, as metaphysically oriented. So there's something about that way of painting that has to do with capturing something about underlying reality beyond the sensual. And that's what I was really interested in with painting. And that's when I started to really explore certain mystical schools, because that's their orientation also. So I ended up studying Jewish mysticism, because they're very keen on trying to understand, particularly in the Middle Ages, in the 1200s, they're trying to develop a kind of schema to understand what bridges the gap between utter immateriality. This is kind of a Neoplatonic way of thinking. Underlying reality where there's complete immateriality, and how we end up in this material manifest world. What accounts for the gap between those two? So, and they end up positing very elaborate system to try to understand that. And I became really interested in studying that. And really the study of it is part of the practice, because the study of all that material, and it's really generations of accumulated material, the study of all that triggers insights, and those insights and little revelations are actually mystical practice in their own right. And of course, as an artist working on my own work, there would be, revelations going along with that same kind of practice. So there were a lot of parallels for me. And really working on my dissertation at the same time in the studio and painting at the same time was a very rich period, because the two different practices would really speak to each other. And the guy I ended up doing my dissertation about in the Middle Ages he developed certain practices having to do with numerology and counting and what's called letter combination or letter permutation.
Right.
Because in Hebrew, letters have numerical values. So he was very numerically oriented also. So I gravitated towards him, and he had this sort of sense that numbers represent something essential, something from the immaterial. So if you can work with numbers, that's a way to sort of bridge that gap to the immaterial, to the metaphysical that I was talking about before. So that's why counting and as both a meditative practice to focus the mind in the way you were talking about, and also to sort of encounter the immaterial is part of what I do.
So one thing, you and I have talked about this quite a bit because I'm also kind of interested in the metaphysical, and what I want to know, I've not ever asked you this question before. Do you have any sort of, how do you feel? How do you feel working in the studio, emptying your mind or focusing your mind on something so incredibly specific? Do you feel like coming out of the studio and then interacting with others is kind of like there's a moment where you have to kind of snap back into reality, or how does that make you feel? Because I know how it feels to meditate for 20 minutes or half an hour, and even that can get you in such a blissful, spaced out state that it takes a little bit of time to come back from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are all a variety of experiences going on, and they're not always as completely pure as what you're describing. I have a brain like everybody else's, and it wants to do its own thing, and that can be pretty negative at times, or it can be the opposite. So there are techniques that I use in addition to the counting. The counting is sort of always going on. But there are other things that I do, some of which are just borrowed directly out of Buddhist practice, mindfulness practice, and some having to do with just things that I have learned over time help me to focus my mind and return to what I'm doing, what I call objects of contemplation, and I have a whole series of them that I can kind of rotate through. There's one in particular that really in the last couple of years, they're almost like koans, again, to talk about Buddhist practice, the way koans can focus the mind. I have my own, and part of it, one of my original sort of objects of contemplation was just, I would have moments of recognizing, the absurdity of what I'm doing. And I think that's sort of built into my practice, is the kind of absurdity of doing this repetitive action, hour after hour, day after day. So just trying to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing is a very absorbing, contemplative activity in its own right. But there's also one thing that I think about also, and this has a lot to do with just trying to understand what creative practice is all about. I'm working in this sort of state where one act follows the next, and everything is kind of following this causal chain. And I'll just sort of bring my awareness to that, how everything is following this sort of causality. And that can kind of extend out. I mean, the whole idea of a deterministic world that we live in is based on this idea that everything follows from causes. And when you have a real revelatory experience of that, then the idea of selfhood, of creative activity, of volition, all these kinds of things can become very problematic and almost dissolve away. And that's when I can find that I'm really kind of in this almost flow state with the work,
Right.
where all these sort of preconceptions that we take for granted kind of come into question and can dissolve, and then I'm just in, encountering the work directly.
I think there's a kind of presence to each of these paintings, and in a lot of sort of modern day, I don't even know if New Age is what we call it anymore, jargon. There's been this focus on staying present and being in the moment, and not being in the past, not being in the future, but being present. And there is a presence to each of these paintings that I think you bring, just purely based on your intensity of intention and practice and focus. That's just something I wanted to just sort of mention as well. We've gotten a couple.
Well,
I'm sorry, do you want to speak to that?
I was just going to say about that. Well, part of, and this again is to borrow from Buddhist thinking, is part of that presence is coming to terms with whatever is going on and not trying to chase it away. And that has a lot to do with the show title for our show was Permutation as Refinement. So I won't go too far into that unless you want me to.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, you might as well. It's a heady title.
Yeah, so there's a Hebrew word that was very important for a particular mystic who I studied in the 1200s. And it's the word is tseruf, which means two different things. It means permutation, and he is engaged in the activity of letter permutation as a meditative practice. So that word is very important to him. And I feel like I'm engaged in a kind of coloristic permutation practice. So it definitely relates to my process. But the word also means refinement, and that refers to the refinement of metals. Right. And when this particular mystic is talking about this dimension of the term, he talks about how it's an internal process of refinement. And he talks about it as going through a kind of fire, the same way that you fire metals to purify them. So this applies a lot to that sort of presence that you're talking about, because a lot of times we might want to shy away from what's happening in the present moment when it's less than pleasant, especially these days when distractions are limitless. But if you want to go through this sort of process of refinement that he's describing, there's this encounter that has to happen with whatever is happening in the moment. So.
And that's the fire?
Right. It can be. But what he says, and this is interesting, he's writing in Italy in the 1200s, he says there's no having that kind of blissful experience without first going through that fire.
Yeah.
And there are very sort of originary Buddhist doctrines that say exactly the same thing. There are suttas, verses that may go back to Buddha himself, where he talks about having to have an encounter with Mara, who's their idea of the demonic. You can't achieve any sort of spiritual progression unless you invite and welcome that encounter. So it's sort of counterintuitive in a way in terms of how we think about, the bliss of meditative practice. But two sides to that coin.
We let's see. Oh, well, we got the question, but we already got the answer just now. So what does the show title Permutation as Refinement mean? Thanks for that question. Josh Hagler's been commenting quite a lot, and he is asking, is this Isaac Luria? And I'm wondering if that is the mystic, maybe?
Luria is a few generations later. This is
Right.
Abraham Abulafia.
Yeah. And then he also asked, and Josh, I don't know if you can type back in if you're still there, but he also typed in earlier Tzimtzum, Tzimtzum.
Right.
I don't know what that
So,
means, so I'm throwing that out
yeah.
there.
So that's also a conception from the 16th century. So that's a few centuries later. But it's based on the same problematic, which is how to understand the gap or how to harmonize a conception of the utterly divine and immaterial and the material and imperfect world that we live in. So Tzimtzum is this idea that God, through this act of will, actually contracted his essence and withdrew himself to some extent from the created world in order to make it imperfect. And that's the world that we live in, and the mystical project is to sort of achieve this return to the divine.
We also have another question from artist Andrew Worth. Is it important to you that viewers of your work understand the philosophy behind its creation, or are you happy if they appreciate the work on purely formal grounds?
Yeah, I'm definitely happy if they just appreciate it on formal grounds. And I kind of, formalism is a tricky thing, and I kind of feel like if you're appreciating something formally, then maybe even in a kind of subversive way, you must be absorbing something else that will work on you given the time, you
Yeah.
know? So maybe in later reflection, or it might hit you, just out of nowhere, that there's something else going on. And that's enough for me. But yeah, my preoccupation in terms of the material terrestrial side of things is to just satisfy formal criteria and have the painting work on that level. And if that doesn't happen, then nothing else will happen either.
So I wanted to ask you too, just since, part of the reason why we're here today and doing what we're doing is because um, our lives have changed overnight, and what looks like they'll be changed for quite a little while. And I was wondering if that is having any effect in the studio at all, and if so, how is that manifesting?
Yeah. Well, it's not. It's only manifesting in my head, but it's definitely. Well, first of all, my quarantine is over until homeschool ends, so that's one thing. I'm in kind of reverse quarantine.
Right.
But it did trigger something for me, and this kind of gets into a whole other thread having to do with Renaissance thought and the Sistine ceiling and all of those other things that enter formally into the work. But so actually, there have been a couple, I think, of three bestsellers in recent years that have been devoted to this idea that humanity lost something with the end of the Paleolithic and the beginning of modern civilization and agrarian society, and all of the ills that it brought. One of those ills being pandemic diseases.
Mm.
Those didn't happen in the days of hunter-gatherer groups, but also all the kinds of mental fallacies and things that lead you down the wrong path, having to do with competitiveness and materialism. This is maybe a bit of an idealized view of the Paleolithic, but in a time when there were no personal possessions, there was no private property, there were no power structures, there were just sort of hunter-gatherer bands, these kinds of things, it's thought at least, weren't in the picture. And I first really got interested in this whole field from seeing the movie Cave of Forgotten Dreams. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's about the
Writing it down now.
yeah, it's about the cave paintings at Chauvet Cave in France.
Oh, was this Werner Herzog's?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. great.
Really amazing.
Yeah.
So it triggered this whole enterprise on my part of, and everybody else's as well, trying to understand the sort of state of mind behind the creation of those paintings,
Right.
and this other way of thinking about contemporary society versus the Paleolithic. It at least raises the question whether the approach to that art making was a little less tainted with all of the concerns that enter in these days. So that's an object of contemplation for me in its own right. And it's definitely thinking about what we've wrought in terms of what's happening around us today is just bringing me back to that way of thinking. It occurred to me later also, there is this natural tendency to sort of hearken back to a better time, an earlier time. So this is my tendency also thinking about, this idealized conception of what early art making might have been about. But it's also very much about an idea that is important in the Renaissance, enters into my composition, deriving compositions for my paintings based on the Sistine Chapel ceiling image that we've talked about so much. There's an idea of return built into the Kabbalistic conception that I was talking about before, of returning to that sort of primordial divine state. And that is troped in terms of achieving the likeness of primordial Adam. So that's the mystical objective, really, is to achieve the likeness of Adam before he's expelled from the Garden of Eden.
The primordial.
So what's interesting about that, it sort of hit me, that's very interesting because Adam in the Garden of Eden is actually a hunter-gatherer. And when he's expelled, he becomes, a farmer. And Genesis is rife with these descriptions of how much hardship he's going to be going through, having been expelled from this primordial state. He'll be in this state of suffering as a result. So there's this sort of retracing and achieving that earlier state that's involved in the mystical conceptions.
Wow. I don't see how we could end on that note, so I have to ask you, just to transition, you have a a son, you were mentioning homeschooling, and I'm sure some of these ideas that you're just talking about also come into play in terms of the life that you would want for him, or how you envision the world that he will be growing up in. And do you want to speak to that at all, about how those play together?
Yeah. Well, what I try to do to the best I can is just connect with him in terms of what's already in him, and not try to map anything onto him, and see what's there and bring that out best I can. I mean, that's very similar to painting practice, really. It's just responding to what's there and accepting what's there, not being in a state of conflict with it. And
he's there in the studio with you quite a lot, right?
Right, yeah.
He sees the purity of your practice and your intention, and I'm sure that also is going to have a long-lasting effect on him as a person.
I have no idea. Somehow this is his idea of normal, so I don't know what that will lead to. Yeah.
Well, this has been incredible. I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but we do want to try to load this on our, on our sites and things, so we can't bog it down too much, with the size of the file too much longer. But it's just, we should do this again, because I feel like there's so many things that we could discuss. And
okay, next Saturday.
Are you free? I want to thank everybody for tuning in and for however long you've been here. We appreciate you listening. It's always so nice to get to hear the artist's voice. We obviously get to see the work, but to hear who the person is behind the work can be incredibly elucidating. So, and I think that there is so much conceptually behind these works that is surprising. You know, as the question was asked, how important is that to you? It can be surprising if you're just sort of taking it at face value. So, thank you for sharing, as they say, the mysteries of your world.
Well, I really appreciate it. It's a privilege for me, so thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. I hope that you all stay safe, stay well, and are able to be mindful and present and enjoy the gifts of this spring that there are to be received.
Amen.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye bye.